Hey everyone, I'm Marianna. This is Impression Blend, and we need to talk about Sundance because that is something I was up to in the beginning of February. As you may have heard, the festival was virtual this year, so just like with the festivals last fall, I got to attend from my couch, which was great. I have no complaints. Today, I'm going to talk about every single film I watched at the festival, the best, the worst, and everything in between, and I am going to rank every single one of these in this special Sundance wrap-up. It's going to be a long one, so get comfortable, grab yourself a snack, make a coffee or a tea, whatever you prefer, and let's start at the bottom of the list with the worst. So as always, we're going to turn to my Letterboxd where I actually made a list for all of these, and starting at the bottom is Users. Users was part of the documentary competition, and when I read the description for this, it sounded fantastic. It sounded exactly up my alley because it promised to peer into the internal organs of technologically dependent planet and marvel at the fears of a world where a child is not only at risk of a warming Earth, but comes to trust a perfectly constructed artificial caretaker over his own biological mother. That is literally what the description said. I read directly from it, and from that I thought, wow, it's going to explore how the technology affects us as a society, how things are progressing beyond our ability to catch up with them and all of that. And instead what I got was kind of a really high production video essay that really didn't have that much to say. You think I'm joking, but there is very little narration in this one. There are huge pauses between each narration piece. It's very pretty, don't get me wrong, but it just doesn't contribute that much to a conversation. There really isn't a conversation in there. There are just some technophobic statements in there, which is kind of a pet peeve of mine. Like, if you're going to go into this with a technophobic point of view, then at least say something interesting, say something valuable. But no, it's very general and there just isn't that much to it. I am so surprised the director actually won the directing award at the US documentary competition. This is by far the worst thing I saw at Sundance, and I would not recommend this to anyone. Like, even if you're sold by the premise of it, which I read, that's not what you're going to get. The premise has more thought behind it than the actual documentary, if you could call it that. So yeah, that was a 3 out of 10. And we are moving on to Strawberry Mansion. This one was another film where the premise sounded super interesting. It is a sci-fi film. Listen to this. In a future where the government records dreams and taxes them, a dream auditor gets caught up in the dreams of an aging eccentric. Doesn't that sound like an amazing and really creative premise? Yeah, it is, but what you get is this ridiculously colorful and insane acid trip, and I just didn't want to be on it. This was not something I needed in my life. It was just way too weird for me. I did not connect with this at all, and I was really disappointed because the premise sounded fantastic and I thought I was going to love this, and some people did love it somehow, but I'm sorry, I can't relate. And speaking of disappointments, by far the biggest disappointment of the festival for me was John and the Hole. This one sounded, once again, so promising, but also it had an amazing cast behind it. We have Dexter himself, Michael C. Hall, we have Jennifer Ehle, we have Taissa Farmiga, Charlie Shotwell is someone we're all familiar with from Captain Fantastic and quite a few other things, so I thought this was going to be solid. This was supposed to be a psychological thriller where a kid holds his family hostage in this hole in the ground, essentially, and I was very intrigued by that premise. I thought this was going to be something where we really dig deep into the psychology of things and why he's doing this and explore family dynamics in some way, but none of that really happened. It was just so slow, and it wasn't the kind of slow burn where you're really getting into it and it's very interesting. No, it was just slow and boring, and that's that. It was not funny. It was not thrilling. It was not that psychological. It was not really even that mysterious. It was just really annoying, in my opinion. I have very strong thoughts on this movie, and they're all negative. There's very little that I appreciated about it. And on top of it, some of it was just so hard to believe. I don't want to get into the details of it, but there are some parts of it that were just, that just wouldn't happen. That is ridiculous. So yeah, I was not a big fan of this film. And the only reason I'm giving it a 4 out of 10 and not less than that is because of the cast. That's pretty much it. Now, this next one, I feel like it's going to get some sort of following when it comes out and is more widely available, because I can see people making this a cult thing. For me, this did not work at all, and I am talking about Prisoners of the Ghostland. I was once again really looking forward to this movie. This is a Sion Sono film. It stars Nicolas Cage, Sofia Boutella. The premise for this sounds like it would be a lot of fun. You have this criminal played by Nicolas Cage who is on a mission to break a curse and rescue this girl. It's futuristic, but dystopian futuristic. It's pretty much Mad Max, but kind of a samurai western. It's a crazy mix of things, and it could have worked. I can tell that it could have worked, but for me, it didn't. It's very memorable. I'll give it that, just based on the premise itself, but it just doesn't go far enough, I think, and it remains in this weird space where it's too weird to be a regular action dystopian film, but it's not weird enough to be like crazy good and crazy unique. So it was just okay, which is surprising considering this premise and this cast. You do get Nicolas Cage doing his Nicolas Cage thing, if you know what I mean. So if you're there for that, you're not going to be disappointed, perhaps. And some of what he does is funny because it is ridiculous, but it just did not come together. And at the end of it, I didn't really feel thrilled or satisfied or mind blown or anything like that. For a film, once again, with this cast and this premise and this promising of a setting, which by the way is surprisingly underused, it just didn't leave as much of an impression as I hoped. That's pretty much where I am with that. I'm very curious what the response to this is going to be once more people get to see it, because maybe I need to watch it again. Maybe I was in the wrong mood to watch it, but as is, I was very underwhelmed and ended up giving it a 5 out of 10. Now, closing off my bottom 5 is a Swedish horror film, Knocking. This one, you will hear this a lot in this video. This one had a promising premise that just lacked great execution. In this case, the premise is this woman gets released from a psychiatric hospital and she starts hearing this knocking noise, and she doesn't know where it's coming from or what's going on, and things kind of escalate from there, but not really. This film sounds like it could have built into this psychological thriller that's very tense, and then has the lead character that is completely unraveling and everything just goes crazy at the end. But in reality, it was surprisingly slow and it didn't really go anywhere that exciting. It got really repetitive really quickly, and I was pretty bored watching it, which is not what you want when you're watching a horror film that promises a very tension-filled experience. That was just not it. I ended up giving it a 5 out of 10. I don't have a lot to say about it because it didn't really feel like it needed to be a feature film, if I'm being honest. Now, this next set of films, which there are quite a few in here, are films that I felt like were on their way to do something interesting, but just never really got there. And that section is starting with Censor. Censor is a film that sounded really intriguing once again. An interesting premise that I just felt needed better execution. Censor is about a woman who is a film censor working on the video nasties. It's set in the past. If you don't know what video nasties are, they're essentially horror films that were deemed inappropriate back in the day. Look it up. It is an interesting concept and a really strange take on censorship. But anyways, this woman decides to try to solve her sister's disappearance, and this all connects to a video nasty that she was editing, and then things just get really strange because it starts trying to blur the lines between reality and fiction. I thought the start of this film was very, very promising. It was kind of this psychological thriller slow burn that was actually really good. It was touching on some interesting ideas. It felt like it was building up to something. It felt like it was going somewhere interesting. And then it just, how do I say this without spoiling the film? It got really strange and it took a turn for a completely different kind of film. And if that was where it started, if that type of film was where it started, then it would have been fine. But it just, to me, felt very disconnected from where we started and where we ended up. So it kind of felt like two different ideas got mixed into one thing, but it just didn't work as well as intended. It also felt like the whole idea of blending reality and fiction was more of a stylistic choice without much need narratively behind it. And yeah, that didn't work for me so well. So I ended up giving it a 5 out of 10. I wish I liked it more. I think once again, some people are going to really enjoy this one. It was just not for me. I wish it was done better and in a more coherent way. Next up, Human Factors. This is about a home invasion that is happening to a middle-class family, and it's supposed to explore the dynamics within this family, but really it doesn't do much. It's once again a very, very slow film where not much happens, and it has an interesting idea behind it, but it just doesn't know what to do with it. And that's pretty much it. It just explores the same thing from different angles, but it doesn't do anything interesting with it, which was very disappointing, and I ended up giving it a 5 out of 10. There was a good movie somewhere in there, and I think the cast deserved a better film, but it just didn't happen. Another film that I kind of felt this way about was Hive, and I was hoping that I was going to really enjoy this one. It's about a woman who starts her own small business to provide for her children. She's trying to figure out her life for herself and the family while her husband is missing, and she struggles with a lot of things on that path. This sounds like a very interesting drama in my opinion, and what it has going for it is a very, very strong lead performance. However, once again, it just doesn't have something that's really going to push it to the next level, and it ended up being a film that I really didn't connect with that much. I also thought the pacing was way off on this one, and generally there was nothing about the story or the filmmaking itself that truly stood out to me. So this didn't really leave that much of an impression outside of the lead performance. So you guessed it, 5 out of 10 here. Next up, I watched Coming Home in the Dark, and this one I did not know what to expect. I was kind of pleasantly surprised here. It is a road trip horror movie, which just sounds like a fun idea, and it all hangs on the charisma of the lead actor, who you may be familiar if you've seen Vampire Diaries and the originals. He plays Elijah. Here he plays a very different role. He tortures and kills people, which I guess he plays a vampire in those shows too, so maybe not that different. But he feels a lot more unhinged and a lot meaner here, and the beginning of this film really grabs your attention. It's really brutal and really captures you right away. However, from that point on, it kind of starts losing its steam as you find out why he's torturing this family, what's going on. It doesn't have the punch to match the setup. And towards the end, you're kind of left wondering, is that it? That's where you went with this? It was okay. It's definitely an effective thriller, and some people have compared it to Funny Games, which is an interesting comparison, and I can see where that's coming from, but it's nowhere near the level of Funny Games. It needed something to add to its stripped down concept, either something stylistically or narratively or just something to elevate this film, which it didn't have. But it is an effective thriller, so I think fans of this type of thriller are going to find something to enjoy about it. And the lead performance is strong, and it is a very memorable villain. Ended up giving this one a 6 out of 10. Next up, I have I Was a Simple Man. And this one, we're going back to the idea of an interesting premise that just is not executed as well as it should have been. It centers around this family in Hawaii and a man who is approaching his death, and then the ghosts of his past start haunting him. So it's this kind of magical realism thing, which sounds like the most fascinating premise for a film about mortality and death. And while I did find it very atmospheric and very moody, and I thought towards the end it actually finally started bringing things together, overall, once again, very slow. The pacing felt way off, and it just needed more to keep your attention. It is a very meditative film about family and hope and life and death and purpose of life. And if you are into this type of stuff, which I normally am, maybe if you're in the right mood to watch it, then it will work for you. I did think it was pretty good. I ended up giving it a 6 out of 10, but I think it could have been so much better and so much more interesting. Next, I have a very highly anticipated comedy, and that is Together Together, starring Ed Helms and Patty Harrison. I would say that this one is probably going to work for a lot of people. It's about a 40-year-old man who hires a young woman to be a surrogate for his child, and it tackles love in a platonic way. It doesn't go the way that you would expect a film with this premise to go, which was very refreshing, and I did really enjoy that part of it. I also have to say the chemistry between the two leads was really good, and I thought it was a very heartwarming film, surprisingly heartwarming. But for me, it just hit way too many familiar beats. Not even from the perspective of I've seen a film like this before exactly, because as I mentioned, it doesn't go for the obvious route. However, once you get to every scene, you immediately know where this scene is going to go and why it's here. So that was not that great. Also, not all of the humor hits, but that's very individual. We all have a different sense of humor. Finally, the ending, which I'm not going to spoil, I was not on board with how abrupt it was. That's all I'm going to say. That ending, I was not a big fan of, and I ended up giving this a 6 out of 10. However, if you need a quick, lighthearted movie that at least attempts to do something different, I think you should check this one out. Next up, I have Pleasure, and I feel like this one is going to be a love it or hate it film for a lot of people. As you can see by my rating, I was a little bit middle of the road on it, but I will explain in a minute. It is a film about a young woman who moves from Sweden to the United States in hopes of becoming a porn star. And it is centered around the porn industry. If you're not prepared for a lot of adult content and some very uncomfortable sexual abuse, then this movie is definitely not for you, because it will be a lot for you to take in. However, if you're okay with that, give it a try and figure out how you feel about it yourself. For me, my biggest problem was that I just didn't think it did anything that special with the story. If you take the setting of it out of the movie, then you're left with a pretty basic premise of a girl trying to make it, and the question of how far are you willing to go to reach your goal, and if you do reach it, is it going to be worth it after you made certain choices? It's a story that has been told many, many times for decades, and the only thing it has going for it truly that makes it interesting is that this is about the porn industry, and the goal that this girl has isn't something that we've seen on screen in a film before, at least. I haven't seen it done this way. So I absolutely can see people praising it for that and for taking this fresher approach to it, but at its core, it's nothing new. So I was slightly disappointed by it. I ended up giving it a 6 out of 10. I do think it is an interesting way to tell this story, but I just wished there was more to it. Next up, I have 8 for Silver. This is a period piece horror film about werewolves. It is set in the late 1800s in this remote village, and there is an investigation of an attack by wild animals that obviously are not wild animals because this is a film about werewolves. And I actually enjoyed it more than I thought I would. The biggest problem with this film is that it can't really find its tone. At first, it feels like it's something that is very self-aware and is purposefully taking itself too seriously. But then you realize that it actually is meant to be taken seriously and it is not supposed to be funny. So that was a little bit jarring. Also, the low budget really shows in the special effects. Some of the CGI is absolutely awful by today's standards. I've seen people compare it to The Witch, which you guys know I love, and I think that is completely off. Yes, it is a period piece that is a horror film, and I think this is a genre I actually really enjoy. However, it doesn't have nearly as much psychological and thematical power as The Witch does. This is meant to be a pretty straightforward, sometimes jump scares, sometimes tension type of horror film. Basically, if you want to see a pretty solid horror film with plenty of gore and plenty of action, that is a rather classic werewolf story, 8 for Silver is definitely for you and you are going to enjoy it. I ended up giving it a 7 out of 10 and I would definitely recommend it to horror fans. Next, I have Passing, which is the directorial debut of Rebecca Hall. And this one has a fantastic cast in Tessa Thompson, Ruth Negga, and Alexander Skarsgård. The film is an adaptation of a novella and it is about 2 friends who used to be high school friends but fell out of touch, and currently one of them is living as a Black woman and the other one is passing as a white woman, even though both of them are Black. And this is basically about the 2 clashing realities of theirs when they meet. I thought this was a very strong directorial debut from Rebecca Hall. I also loved that this was a story that doesn't get told very often, and it was so refreshing to see this on screen. It is gorgeously shot in black and white. It is obviously beautifully performed by its actors, and I just wish there was more depth to it, and there was room for that. I just don't know why they decided to not go for it and to not dig deeper. It's kind of like they were sort of intimidated by telling this story. So it didn't turn out as amazing as I was hoping it would, but it is still a very beautiful, atmospheric, and thought-provoking film that is absolutely worth seeing. I ended up giving this one a 7 out of 10 as well. Next up, I have a documentary, All Light Everywhere, and this one actually I ranked higher at first, but as the time went on, I realized it wasn't really sticking with me as much as I initially thought it would. The topic of this is absolutely fascinating, and unlike Users, this documentary actually goes out to explore what it sets out to to explore. This is about the biases of seeing things. It's all about the point of view and the perspective and how you can never have the full picture. Because even if you think you're looking at the full picture, and if you think you are watching an unbiased perspective, there's still always somebody behind the camera, so to speak. In this case, a lot of it has to do with police cameras, with body cameras, and with watching neighborhoods and how people behave and how much we miss because we look at certain things instead of looking at the whole picture. It's a very interesting exploration of what seeing and being seen and watching and being watched means and how it reflects on human behavior. Actually, now that I'm talking about it, I'm wondering why it didn't stick with me more, because it's absolutely something that is worth exploring, and I haven't seen a lot of documentaries or films explore this topic before. I ended up giving this one an 8 out of 10. Check it out when you get the chance to. Now, next up is my most anticipated film of the festival, which is Primetime. And as you can tell, I didn't love it as much as I hoped I would, but I still found it very interesting, and it is a tension-filled one-location thriller. This is about a guy who in 1999 on New Year's Eve locks himself in a TV studio. He has 2 hostages with him, a gun, and he has a message that he wants to broadcast live to the world. This sounded like a fascinating premise to me. I also love one-location thrillers, and it stars Bartosz Bilenia, whom I loved in Corpus Christi. I talked about that in my top 10 movies of 2020 video. And this film generally was what I wanted it to be, except for it left way too much to interpretation. Normally, I am a fan of ambiguity, and I think ambiguity is a good thing, but there are a lot of parts of it that are just implied, and you're left guessing a lot about the character, a lot about his relationships, a lot about his past, about what he's trying to say. There's just too much that is left behind the scenes, so to speak. I am absolutely sure that the actors and the director, the writer, knew what they were trying to say and knew all of the answers to these questions, but they did not leave enough clues for the audience. So as far as a tension-filled thriller, it works, absolutely, but it is not satisfying to the extent that I wish it was. And obviously the lead performance is fantastic, as I expected. I did enjoy the film, ended up giving it a 7 out of 10. I would consider this to be an honorable mention because even though it is flawed, I still think it's worth watching, and it left an impression on me, maybe because I was so excited for it. But I do think a lot of people would enjoy this one, and I do think it is an interesting thriller and something that is worth watching. Next up, another memorable film that is kind of a thriller. It has the elements of a thriller, but it is more of a dark comedy / drama, and that is On the Count of Three. It is about 2 friends who make a pact to end their lives, but they decide that they have some unfinished business, so they decide to give this until the end of day. And I have to say, this takes the idea of what would you do if you only had 1 day to live to a whole new level. I thought this was very memorable. I actually enjoyed it more than I thought I would, and I particularly really enjoyed the dark humor in it. The performances by Jared Carmichael, who actually directed this film, and the other friend is Christopher Abbott. The 2 of them really work as leads in this film, and you do buy them as these 2 slightly unhinged best friends that have a lot behind them and that know each other really well. The issue for me was that the story became pretty repetitive pretty quickly, and it kind of lost its way in the middle. And the ending of this is very obvious. You can figure out what's going to happen pretty early on. At least that's how it felt to me. So I ended up giving it a 7 out of 10 because of that. However, I would absolutely recommend it if this sounds like your cup of tea. And this is one of my other honorable mentions that did not make my top 5, obviously, but I think it's a film that is worth paying attention to. Next up, a documentary directed by Edgar Wright. Yes, Edgar Wright decided to do a documentary about the Sparks brothers, whom I've never heard of in my entire life, and that's kind of the premise of it. The idea behind this documentary is that they are this amazing duo that are one of the most interesting musicians out there that you probably have never heard of. And after watching it, I think that is definitely true. The two are absolutely fascinating. They are so unusual and so creative, and they always try something new in their music and their presentation. They are not looking to settle with what they're trying to do. They're looking to keep pushing the envelope, and that is fascinating about them. My main criticism of this documentary is that it is just too long. It goes over every single album that these guys released, and there are a lot of them because they are still around and still making music, which is impressive because they've been around for a very long time. However, as fascinating as they are, watching a documentary about musicians that is 2 hours and something like 15 minutes long, it's over 2 hours, you have no idea who these people are, and it just keeps going and going and going, and describing every album they've released. It's just, you get a little bit tired of it. At least I did. But it is a very, very well-made documentary, and there are some really cool cameo type of interviews in there, which I'm not going to spoil. So I would highly recommend checking this out, but just be aware that this is going to be very long, but also really good. I ended up giving it an 8 out of 10. Next up, I have The Pink Cloud, and that is a Brazilian sci-fi film that is oddly reminiscent of our current situation in the world, but was written and filmed before the pandemic. It is basically about this pink cloud that appears out of nowhere and quickly kills people. So people are stuck inside their homes, unable to go out, waiting for some kind of solution to arrive, and they just keep waiting and waiting, and this sounds very, very familiar. So I can tell that some people are just going to be not into this kind of premise because, let's be real, none of us want to see quarantine movies at the moment. I found the film really interesting because it explores a kind of forced family dynamic. The two people that we meet in the beginning of this film are not together. They are not living together. They just kind of had a one-night stand type of relationship. And now they're stuck inside for an indefinite amount of time, and they kind of have to start building a relationship from there. And that is interesting to observe. They go through different stages, different levels of connection, and I found that aspect of it fascinating. There were some things about this film that just seemed questionable and seemed like either plot holes or gaps in logic. So it wasn't the perfect film by any means, but I did really, really enjoy it. It was an 8 out of 10 for me. And I think if you are interested in that psychological approach to quarantine, you will find it interesting as well. It's kind of crazy though, how much of what happens in this film, just the little details, are predicting our 2020 that we had exactly. It's kind of strange and creepy, to be honest. Next up, I have another film that is 100% going to be hit or miss for people because it is written and directed by Ben Wheatley. And if you've ever seen his films, you know he's a very love it or hate it director. The film I'm talking about is In the Earth. It is about a near future where after a disastrous virus has wreaked havoc on the world, a scientist and a park scout venture deep into the forest for an equipment run. The best way I can describe this film is a Ben Wheatley take on Annihilation. So If you did not enjoy Annihilation, if you thought it was way too strange and too ambiguous and the whole like relationship between human and nature and the oddness of it just didn't work for you, this is not going to be something you enjoy. The other influence that comes to mind here is Midsommar, but that is kind of a minor influence. I got that vibe from it as well, but mainly Annihilation because of the whole traveling into the zone where things are strange situation. What surprised me about this film is there is some very strategically placed, very dark humor that I did not expect. These were the moments that were pretty awful, and that kind of comic relief just helped you get through them and helped you take your mind off the awful graphic stuff that was happening. It kind of sounds strange. It kind of sounds like it wouldn't work, but if you see it, you will know what I mean. And this has been picked up by Neon for distribution, so we are going to see it at some point soon. Well, I already seen it. You guys are going to get the chance to see it. I ended up giving it an 8 out of 10. This is definitely a film I want to watch again because there are certain aspects of it that, at least for me, feel like require a second viewing to fully understand what's going on there. But yeah, I ended up giving it an 8 out of 10 on my first viewing. I might change that rating on my second viewing, but for now, that's where it is. And I am cautiously giving that as an honorable mention for specific people for whom this premise sounds interesting. The last thing leading up to my top 5 is a documentary, Misha and the Wolves. This one is so difficult to talk about because I don't want to spoil it if you don't know what's going on, and it is very easy to spoil. So what I'm going to say about it is an absolutely insane story. And the problem with this documentary is that it goes really hardcore, like it goes too far on the drama on the first part of the story. And then after that, it doesn't explore what it should have explored to the depth that it deserved, because you are left with a lot of questions because of what you find out. That's my vague description of this documentary. It is basically about a woman who wrote a Holocaust memoir about how she survived the Holocaust. And that is where I'm going to leave this. I initially ended up rating it pretty high. I ended up rating it a 9 out of 10 because of how insane this story is. But as I sat with it, I realized that it was more flawed than I initially thought, just because the initial impression of the story wore off a little bit and I was left analyzing how it was actually done, and that's where the flaws come in. So I am downgrading it to an 8 out of 10, and it is out of my top 5, but it is almost there. It has been, I believe, picked up by Netflix, so definitely check it out when you can. All right, we are on to my top 5, and those films I absolutely 100% recommend. I really, really enjoyed them. I thought they were great, and I think these are easily the best of the festival. Starting with The World to Come. This is a very kind of melancholic period piece set in the mid-19th century American East Coast frontier. And it features two neighboring couples who struggle with their isolated lifestyle. The two women become very good friends and perhaps start becoming a little bit more than friends. This film has a fantastic cast in Catherine Waterston, Vanessa Kirby, Christopher Abbott once again, and Casey Affleck. If you like those kind of slow burn romance dramas that are all about the details and the looks and the small kind of implications, and they take their time. If you like that type of thing, you're going to enjoy this. The setting is absolutely gorgeous. There's so much detail to the actual setting. I was at some point just staring at the rooms that they were in and the detail that went into the costumes and the production design. It's just gorgeous. Also, the language is absolutely stunning. I can see that being a bit of a turnoff for some people because it is a very poetic type of dialogue, the way they speak, but they deliver it really well and it seems natural after a while. And I love when a film can do that. I really, really enjoyed this film. The more I think about it, the more it's growing on me. I think for some people it might be too slow, and if from what I'm saying it sounds like it's a film where not much happens, it kind of is that type of film. It's the type of film where not much happens, but also everything happens because everything is in the details and eventually relationships develop. So that is the type of film this is, and it is a period piece. And if you're into that, you're going to love it. Ended up giving it an 8 out of 10. It's a beautiful slow burn. It's a beautiful drama, and there's a lot of attention to detail there, which is just a joy to observe. At number 4, I have One for the Road. This is a roller coaster of a film. It is initially a road trip film that becomes more of a drama from an angle you didn't expect. There's a lot going on there. It's almost like 2 films in one. The premise here is that a guy who is a high-end club owner in New York receives a call from his friend in Thailand, and the friend is in the last stages of terminal cancer. What he wants from his estranged New York friend is for him to come and take him on a road trip to revisit some of his ex-girlfriends and to make some things right. You can see how this lends itself to a very emotional adventure. I wish I could talk more about it, but in order to really get into this film, I would have to talk about the second half of it, and I don't want to spoil any of that. So just trust me that this is quite an adventure, and it is a very, very interesting story that for me worked really, really well. It does get a little bit melodramatic at times, but I think within the context of the film, that was the right choice. Also, it features some of the most fantastic and delicious looking cocktails I have ever seen, and some really spot on songs. The cocktails actually matter to the plot. They relate to certain points of the plot, and that just made me so happy for some reason. I really enjoyed it. I would absolutely watch it again. It is pretty long, but I absolutely think it is worth your time. I ended up giving it an 8 out of 10 initially, but I think on a rewatch, it might head towards a 9 out of 10 for me. It seems like a film that just gets better and better with every viewing. So I am anticipating watching it again, and I hope you guys get a chance to check it out. At number 3, I have the very first film I saw at the festival, and that was CODA, which stands for Child of Deaf Adults. This is a film that is so easy to recommend to people. I think if I were to recommend just one film out of the entire festival to the biggest amount of people I could that I would think most people would enjoy, it would be CODA, because it's that type of movie. The premise here is that you have this girl who is a hearing child in a deaf family, and she's very torn about where to head with life because she loves music and she wants to be a musician, but she is almost afraid to admit that to herself because she feels like she needs to stay with her family and help her family. And you can just tell this is going to be such a heartfelt, feel-good drama that most people would appreciate. This film features some wonderful performances, some very touching moments. It's going to make you tear up even if you don't want to and you're just set in your mind to not cry in movies. This movie is going to challenge you. It's just a film that you want to watch when you want to see something that is going to make you feel good, but not in a cheesy way. It is not a cheesy film. It is wholesome, it is sweet, it is a coming of age story. It is just lovely, and I recommend it to all of you. Now, the runner-up to the best film I saw at the festival is Mass. Mass is a film that you have to be emotionally ready for because it's going to destroy you. The premise is that you have 2 couples who are coming out of a tragedy that has to do with their kids, and they are coming from the very different sides of it. I'm going to tell you what this tragedy is, even though it's not revealed immediately, but I think it's important for people to know what they're going into. It's not a spoiler. It's revealed pretty early in the film. You just don't know right away that this is a movie about a school shooting, and it is absolutely devastating. It is absolutely a conversation that needs to be had, and the fact that it is from both sides, that it is a couple who are the parents of the shooter and the couple who are the parents of one of the dead kids, that makes this film so powerful, and you just struggle along with the characters for them to reach some sort of closure and some sort of understanding. It's a very tough situation, obviously, and it is a very tough film to watch. There are some absolutely heartbreaking performances in here, particularly from Jason Isaacs and Ann Dowd, but all four of the actors just, I feel like they all needed therapy after shooting this film, because the whole film is essentially a conversation. There aren't any actual flashbacks to anything. It's just them talking it out the entire time, which you might think sounds a little boring for a film, but no, this is fantastic. And watching these four people, these four characters talk, watching these ideas and perspectives shift and flow is just so fascinating and so important. I ended up giving it a 9 out of 10. It is easily one of the best films of the festival, and I am pretty sure it's going to stick as one of the best films of the year because it is something else. Now, finally, the best film that I saw at Sundance was an animated documentary, which you guys know I do not watch a lot of animated films, and I almost skipped this one, which is insane. I'm so glad that I did not skip this one. I ended up watching this on the very last day, right before it expired. Just the last thing that I could have possibly watched was Flea, and it was outstanding. Flea is about an Afghan refugee who agrees to tell his story that is very personal about his escape from his country and about the persecution that he faced and how difficult everything was. But his identity is not to be revealed, and that's why the documentary blends this true story and true events, absolutely heartbreaking, with animation, and it tells it in this unusual format. It does insert certain historical footage in there, but none of the actual person and the actual family that this revolves around. I don't really know how else to sell you on this other than this is an incredible story and this is an incredibly done documentary. I think the animation and the style that it's done in really works. It is very serious and at certain points very dark and very sad, but also in other ways very inspiring and just a testament to human determination and human spirit, and you want this guy to be happy. It's an incredible and powerful story. I absolutely recommend you watch it. It is probably the second film that I would recommend to everybody after Coda. Coda is really easy to recommend because it's heartfelt and it's a drama and it's kind of a lighter film. This is nowhere near as light as Coda, but I think it is impossible to dislike this because it's amazing. I ended up giving it a 9 out of 10. To be honest, it might be a 10 out of 10. It was late when I watched it, so maybe it is a 10 out of 10 and I was just tired because at the moment, I can't really think of anything that it had wrong with it. And you know what? I'm just going to do it right now. I'm going to fix it and I'm going to change that to a 10 out of 10 for Flea. All right, guys, that is it for this really long Sundance ranked wrap up. I have this list on my Letterboxd. I will make it public once I publish this video. So if you want to see it, I will leave a link to it in the info box below. The sun has set The room has become dark behind me, so I apologize for the changing lighting. This took way longer to film than I thought it would, and I already thought it would take a long time. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. A special thank you to all of my patrons who are supporting me on Patreon. An extra special thank you to the patrons whose names are on the screen right now. And as always, thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. I appreciate every single one of you. And if you guys enjoyed this video, which I really hope you did, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Follow me on social media where I notify you that new videos have come out because YouTube sometimes won't. But I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you very soon in my next video, which is going to be my February wrap up. All right. Bye.